Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Mary Marie Shelton. I am the community spiritual leader and the senior minister here at Golden Gate Center for Spiritual Living. This is an interesting week and month because we are celebrating diversity and inclusion, and yet, if you look around, you'll notice that diversity is not something we have a huge amount of in the room. I mean, we have a little bit, but we don't have a huge amount of diversity in the room. And one of the challenges for us, I think, as people who are in a largely white community, is that we tend to not see the experience of those who are different from us, or the need or importance of those folks who are different from us. Now, I don't mean that, I'm not trying to put judgment on anybody at all, because in some sense we can't help it. It's the context we grow up in, it's what we're familiar with. But it's also a challenge for us because we live in a world that's increasingly diverse, and for us to include one another means that we have to step into uncomfortable places sometimes, because the way that we culturally communicate with each other is not necessarily always the same on both sides of the conversation or both sides of the issue that we're trying to decide about. And you sometimes have to find ways of listening more, of being inclusive, of saying things in a way that's easier for someone to hear. This fellow says, at the end of his sixth and final golf lesson, my friend asked the pro how he had performed. Well, replied the instructor, you'll never be a pro, but you can get personal enjoyment out of the game and the exercise will do you good. Your main problem is that you're too close to the ball after you swing. That's how I play golf. You're too close to the ball after you swing. Divots, yes, ball might still be right there. So when we're communicating with one another about what we're experiencing, we need to find our way to communicate with the other person what we want them to understand. And sometimes that means we have to communicate differently than the way we are accustomed to communicating. John O'Donohue said, the hunger to belong is not merely a desire to be attached to something. It is rather sensing that great transformation and discovery become possible when belonging is sheltered and true. When belonging is sheltered and true. So I'm talking about today fasting from rejection and feasting on inclusion. That golf pro was trying to include this fellow in the company of people who play golf without saying to him, you're not really very good at this, but instead putting it differently, because the quality of good looks different to a pro than to somebody who's just learning something. Rejection. Everybody has experienced rejection at some point in their lives from somebody. And so I'm going to take just a moment to take you back to what it feels like to experience being rejected. When I was a little kid, for up until I was 9 or 10 years old, I lived in a huge apartment complex that had giant yards, giant gardens, and it was 36 acres. So there were a lot of kids right around where I lived at that time, up until I was about 10 years old. Now, most of them came from, nuclear families, mom, dad, kids. I came from mom and me, because my dad had died. So already I was a little bit different. My mom was quite a bit older than everybody else's mom. And the two families that I was closest to at the time were both Mormon, and they were good friends. And they each had 2 kids. And so one night they were going to the drive-in movie. And these were my friends. And they were all in the station wagon getting ready to go to the drive-in movie. And I was standing on the curb waving goodbye. That was really hard for me. Now, as I look at it in retrospect, it makes perfect sense. But for me, at age 8 or 9 or whatever it was, I felt really abandoned and left out. You can relate to that, I'm sure, how that feels. And when I was a little bit older, one of the girls in my class had a slumber party that I wasn't invited to. And later, she said to me, well, you're too immature to understand what we do at slumber parties. And I had no idea what that meant, really. But I had that same kind of feeling of being embarrassed and left out and rejected. So you all know what that feels like, right? Everybody knows what that feels like. And out of that knowing how that feels, sometimes we try to include somebody that we think is being omitted or ignored or left out. And sometimes it doesn't work well. So when I was in high school, there was a gal in our high school who was, I guess maybe developmentally disabled, maybe she had mental issues, I don't know. But her behavior was odd and it was difficult people shied away from her because of that. And I remember trying to sit with her at lunch and include her and things like that. And what happened was I was not equipped at that age to really be helpful in any way. And it was difficult and uncomfortable and embarrassing. And I felt sorry for her, but I didn't know how to be effective in the situation. Can you relate to that also? Okay, so we know what this rejection feels like when we experience it. We know what this rejection feels like when we witness it happening with somebody else. And we don't want to leave people feeling that way. Ernest Holmes, our founder, said in Words That Heal Today, if there's anything we need, it is peace of mind. Without it, life is not worthwhile. Peace of mind comes only when there is a personal and collective sense of security. This sense of security comes when there is a sense of belonging to the universe. And when we feel like we're alone, it's hard to feel like we belong to the universe either, because it seems like we're disconnected from people and the universe seems like this impersonal thing that doesn't notice us and doesn't care. So when we're on that side of feeling rejected or left out or abandoned, the worst part of it becomes when we also abandon ourselves. When we also listen to the voices of rejection in our head that are saying stuff to us that makes us feel worse. Those lies that tell us nobody's ever going to like you, you don't fit in, who do you think you are? I'm sure that those phrases are not unfamiliar in the room. So when we move toward inclusion, this is when we feel like we belong. We feel like we're home. We feel like we're with our tribe. Maybe we feel honored to be included. In the philosophy of Ernest Holmes, it says that Holmes said, that which is myself is yourself. And that which is yourself is myself. That which is ourself collectively and ourselves individually is one and the only self there is. There is no other self. And so that is that ultimate consciousness within us that is the witness. But in the individuality, where we have our own thoughts and our own opinions and our own history and our own values and our own judgments, that's where we can crash up against each other and have challenges with that experience. This is inclusion. This is diversity. So this bunch of people, they may be different sizes, different ages, different races, different whatever. They may look different. They may sound different. They may see things from a point of view that's entirely foreign to us. And yet we, as a body of religious science, as a body of Centers for Spiritual Living, our desire is to have diversity, to be inclusive, to welcome one another. But there is kind of an assumption underneath that goes along with that I think that as a majority white organization we don't always see, which is that we sometimes think that in order for us to be connected, to be community, to be one, we have to be always nice. We have to always try to get along, to not make waves, to agree. And so we can find that it becomes necessary for us to stifle part of ourselves. You know, I don't know how many people have come to religious science communities when they weren't feeling well and kind of been inadvertently, insensitively put down because they're ill. Well, you know, you got to get your consciousness lined up so that you can step back into wholeness. Doesn't that just feel great? You know, isn't your first desire just to give somebody a smack when they say something like that to you? Not that you would, but you know what I mean. And yes, somebody says, thank you. That wasn't really meant as a rhetorical question. I appreciate that, Stan. We know how that feels. It's like, you think you know more than I know now. You're instructing me. That's really helpful. Thanks so much. And so when we're fasting from rejection, what is our response when we're feasting on inclusion? What is our response? I'm sorry you're feeling that way. I'll keep you in mind and heart in prayer so that you can be better soon, so that you can feel all that vibrancy that you are so often, so much of the time. Somehow to be able to respond to that person in a way that doesn't push us out of our philosophy of wholeness, but doesn't dump it on them at the same time. Both of those things. So the question then that we want to look into a little bit deeper is, who gets rejected? Well, people who are differently abled, mentally or physically. And what I mean by rejection is something very subtle. And I'll talk about that in just a minute, how that happens. Or people who are a different skin tone or race or ethnicity, or men versus women or women versus men. We don't mean to exclude, but we find ourselves going along with a situation in which these diversities are not recognized and welcomed and honored in the way that they might need to be. We sometimes have trouble with age. Too young or too old? Too young to drive, too young to vote, too young to run for office, too old to start a new business, too old to fall in love, too old to whatever it is. And so that becomes a place where we don't make space for each other. Who else gets rejected? Well, people who look like this woman, who are pierced and tattooed. Now, let me tell you something about her, if you haven't seen her online. This is Reverend Nadia Boltz-Weber. She founded an evangelical Lutheran church called the Church of All Sinners and Saints, because she wanted to be a minister for a church of people like her. People that to some folks seem like freaks. It is a huge, thriving congregation. And she speaks the truth from an authentic center that isn't worried about languaging everything so everybody's comfortable all the time. I mean, and by that I mean us. I mean, I think her congregation is perfectly comfortable when she says something is bullshit from the stage. Take a breath in case that was a shock. What I find when I see her, when I see a video of her, is that I am immediately engaged by the amount of heart and compassion and authenticity that she brings to what she does. She is amazing. And she doesn't look like everybody that you see, you know, in here necessarily. And thank God we have a few now who have some tattoos and piercings so that we know, you know, that we are a body of people of diversity. That's what we want to be. That's what we want to welcome. And I love her and what she's doing. Religion can become a barrier, particularly now in our world. People get scared of people they don't know. When they discover that they know somebody who's different than they are, that person is less scary to them. But maybe they can't generalize it to people in that category, just to that one. Or the last one, which is also difficult, is gender identity and sexual orientation, but particularly gender identity, I think now, because it's very complicated for us to recognize that we have grown up largely in a society that is very binary. 2 genders and 2 sexual orientations, maybe 3, but we don't want to talk about that. But the truth is that's not actually accurate in terms of human beings. I have a cousin who has a transgender son. So when my cousin started his family, he had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Now he has 3 sons and a daughter. God bless that family because they have embraced each other with so much love. But what happens when you are someone who recognizes from a young age that you're very different from everyone else that you know, and you're not sure if it's okay, and when you try to put it out there, the response that you get is not very welcoming? What does that do to a little person who has a strong sense of who they are, but they are not allowed to be that? I'm not asking you to answer these questions. What I want to do is to evoke this sense of how important it is to wrestle with difficult questions. So today is Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday is the beginning of Holy Week. It's the last week of Lent. It marks the day that they say that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and the people welcomed him as such a success, as such a savior, as such somebody to look forward to, a fulfillment of the prophecy, that they put their cloaks and palm branches down on the ground for him to ride over. And he came in, this was just a week, less than a full week, before he was arrested, convicted, sentenced, and executed. So, was he a success then when he rode in on Palm Sunday and he was celebrated? Was he a success the day he was arrested and everybody abandoned him? Was he a success when he was bleeding and suffocating to death? Was he a success at the resurrection? How do we know? Where do we point at that life and say, aha, this life is a success? Or where do we withhold that? And how do we do that with ourselves? Where do we look at our life and say, aha, here, now, I'm a success? So this cancels out all that went before. And then maybe we hit another really difficult time. Now is the life still a success? So when Jesus rides in, there are all these people looking at this occurrence from different cultural, ethnic, religious places. And it's interesting, I found this yesterday. Christian theologians believe that this symbolism of him riding in triumphantly into Jerusalem on a donkey was foretold in the book of Zechariah, where it says, "See, your king comes to you righteous and victorious, lowly, riding on a donkey." Okay. Now, to the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish elders, this was equivalent to, as a fulfillment of the prophecy, him declaring he was the king of Israel, which they found very annoying. In the Eastern traditions, in general, in the Middle East, the donkey was a symbol of peace, unlike an animal of war, which would be a horse. So a king would have ridden a horse if he was arriving in war. He would ride a donkey if he were arriving in peace. That's a very different communication than I'm declaring myself the king of Israel. Would you agree? Very different perspective there, right? And in Egypt, it was customary to cover the path of a person you wanted to honor somehow. So putting these palm branches down was what was being done as a part of this custom. In the Greco-Roman culture, the palm branch is a symbol of triumph and victory. And it's the most common attribute of the goddess Nike, or Victoria. And for contemporary Roman observers who were also around there, the procession would have evoked Roman triumph, because when the victor lays down arms and wears the toga, which is a civilian garment of peace, that represents a different kind of entry, which says, I am victorious, which the Romans would not necessarily have taken kindly to. So you getting this? This one event is happening, and people are watching it, and they all have a different perspective on what is being said to them at that time. And so perhaps some of that interpretation is what led to the arrest, the conviction, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus. Because he was seen as a political force by all these different groups. So he was one to be admired and celebrated by one group, but not everybody. He was one to be rejected by those who had a different culture, a different religion, a different faith, a different symbolism. So why, then, do we reject those who are different from us? Sometimes it's just because we're ignorant. We don't even realize that what we're doing is putting a block or a wall between us and somebody else. Sometimes we reject because we're afraid of someone else. Now, for the women in the room, and maybe for some of the guys, but for the women in the room, if you're walking alone down the street and you see a group of young guys who are 18 to 20, and they're pretty big guys, and there's 4 or 5 of them, and they're loud, and they're coming down the street toward you, what do you feel? Do you feel relaxed and comfortable and easy and easygoing? Would you cross the street? Would you forge ahead as strongly as possible and set aside any sense of discomfort? They're not doing anything to threaten you, but they're there. So that's an assumption of holding back because we're fearful. Now, if somebody's already hurt you, then you're likely to back off from them for some reason. But we are also fearful of whatever that group is, change the looks of them. Are they women in the head covering and body covering, the hijab? Are they wearing that? Are they guys, are they Sikhs, men wearing turbans? Are they a bunch of black guys or women? Are they a bunch of old people? Are they developmentally disabled people in a group who are in a class? You know, when we don't know someone, we tend to step back. We don't know them, we don't know what to expect, and we might be afraid of them. Are you with me here? Is this making sense? Sometimes we're just uncomfortable because they're so different. And sometimes, like I was in high school, we feel ill-equipped to respond to them, and we don't know what to say or do, so we avoid it. And finally, sometimes we're just oblivious. We're just oblivious. We just, for us, they don't exist. We don't see them. They're different than we are. They're not part of the circle, and so we just don't even see them there. We don't mean to be rejecting, but it's what we're doing. Ben Zander said in The Art of Possibility, we have at our fingertips an infinite capacity to light a spark of possibility. Passion rather than fear is the igniting force. Abundance rather than scarcity is the context. So the practice of enrollment is about giving yourself as a possibility to others and being ready in turn to catch their spark. It is about playing together as partners in a field of light. Playing together as partners in a field of light. The current chair of our International Centers for Spiritual Living Leadership Council is Tracy Brown. She is an African-American woman who does diversity trainings, and she's written a book recently called The Stained Glass Spirit, which is about spiritual communities of diversity, the stained glass spirit. And she says, diversity is not the problem. It's the stories we tell about diversity that are the problem. When we push it away, the whole thing about immigrants that's going on right now, if we don't currently know someone who is a recent immigrant, we may not recognize what it means to leave home. And yet, unless you're Native American, you come from a line of people who left home. They left home because they had to, or they left home for a greater opportunity, or they left home because they were forced to, or they left home because they were taken, but they left their home countries and they wound up here. And some of those people who came here to escape from difficulties, they came because they were hoping to survive and do better. They're not so different from any of us or our ancestors, not really. Maybe in all those superficial ways that cause us conflicts. Deepak Chopra says giving connects two people, the giver and the receiver, and this connection gives birth to a new sense of belonging. We don't have to be good at this, by the way. What we need to do is be willing. Be willing. So I want to talk about how we reject and also then how we include. So how we reject, first of all, is we ignore. Secondly, we exclude. We don't invite, we don't converse with, we don't include in the conversation. Third is stereotypes and assumptions. We assume that what we've heard, read, seen in the movies is the truth. But actually, it's not. It's heightened in order to get us to pay attention. Sometimes we make demeaning remarks about people or groups of people, not because we meant to put them down, but just because we thought something was funny and we didn't really consider the impact it was going to have on somebody else. I remember telling a joke once. Now, one of the things with me about jokes is that what makes me laugh often is the unexpectedness of the punchline. And in this particular instance, that was true, but the joke was about weight. And I was telling it to somebody who was quite heavy. Tone deaf, completely tone deaf. You know, we are not always good at, and it wasn't an appropriate joke anyway, as I think back on it now. Like, what was I thinking? To even repeat it. Yes, I found it funny because of the punchline, but there's a difference between that and thinking it's something that really should be shared. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes we're tone deaf. And other times we use our own jargon, kind of new thought doublespeak, you know, about consciousness and spirit and treatment and whatever it is. We've got a friend in New York who is always talking to us about people that are friends of hers as if we know them. We have no idea who they are. But she'll say, you know, Julianne was saying to me the other day, blah, 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 and you know, she's this and that and the other, and we're thinking, we have no clue who Julianne is. Why are we having this conversation? This happens with this gal all the time, and I can only guess that she does it with everybody. Either she doesn't remember who knows who, or it just doesn't matter. So she's using her own kind of jargon, but it excludes us. You ever know somebody who does that? So what we want to do instead is include. So instead of ignoring, we want to notice. We want to notice. Instead of excluding, we want to engage, include. Instead of stereotypes and assumptions, how about if we bring curiosity and discovery into it? How about instead of making remarks, we ask questions? Tell me more about that. Some years ago, when I was on the international board for the church, we saw a movie, all of us that were on the board, we saw a movie called The Color of Fear. And we had a very diverse group of people who were on the leadership council. We had a number of people who were African American and people of different ages. We had men and women. And one of my friends on the international board was an African American woman who had grown up in Panama. And I realized at some point in that movie how little I really understood of her experience of life. I assumed it was like mine. But I saw in watching the movie that that probably wasn't true. And I was embarrassed, I was stunned, I was remorseful, and I said something to her about it. And she said, well, let me give you an example. She said, when I was growing up, I was never allowed to leave the house until I was in my best clothing. Now she grew up around the same time I did, so this is not so true today, but there are still other differences. She said, I was never allowed to leave the house until I was dressed in my best clothes so that I would be a credit to my race. Do you ever think about being a credit to your race? And I said, no. And no one's ever suggested that I needed to be. Or that my race would be judged because of what clothing I was wearing on a particular day. Now that is a tiny example of somebody's entire life that was affected by one thing that I had no relationship with and no experience of. And that goes on all the time. And so what we want to do is ask questions, learn, and use respectful, inclusive language. And sometimes when I'm way behind myself here now. There we go. Sometimes when we're in conversation and we're asking questions, we also need to remember that it's really not their job to educate us. You know, we shouldn't be putting that on them. But with an individual who's somebody you want to get to know, it's okay to ask questions, and also ask if it's okay to ask questions. I see you all kind of shifting around out there. And my impression is that either I'm boring you or this is making you uncomfortable. And so what I want to say is, I think that this kind of discomfort is really important for us to be willing to dwell in just a little bit. It's very important because we are entering into a world now that will never be what it was when we were kids. It is multicultural, it is diverse, it is interconnected, and everybody around us has a story that goes back in ways that we don't connect with. But those who are obviously different than us in many ways, their stories are so unfamiliar to us that when we assume that we have the same understanding, the chances are equally good that we'll be wrong, you know? And what we want to do is create this feasting on inclusion. Our global vision for Centers for Spiritual Living says we see our communities as being open, receptive, and welcoming of all people, all faiths, and all paths to God. And Ernest Holmes says in The Science of Mind, an evolved soul judges no one. I'm not quite there yet. Condemns no one, but realizes that all are on the road of experience seeking the same goal, and that all must ultimately find their home in heaven. Ultimately, we all come to the same place. And what I'm realizing in reading Tracy Brown's book, The Stained Glass Spirit, about spiritual communities, is that that does not happen automatically. It happens from effort. It happens from intention. So how do we then feast on diversity and inclusion? You know, if we invite people to come and join us on Sunday who don't look like the rest of the congregation in some way, it's good to warn them ahead of time and say, we're trying to do something here to expand who we have with us. You know, let me know how I can help you be more comfortable and how we can help each other be more inclusive. I want to finish with a poem by Hafiz, who was a great Sufi master. Hafiz is the most beloved poet of Persia. He was born in Shiraz, lived about the same time as Chaucer in England, and about 100 years after Rumi. And when he died, it was thought that he had written an estimated 5,000 poems, of which 500 to 700 have survived. We became aware of him in the United States mostly through Goethe, and his enthusiasm rubbed off on Emerson, and Emerson translated Hafiz in the 1800s, and even Sherlock Holmes quotes him in some of the stories. So this is about inclusion and compassion. It's called Bring the Man to Me. A perfect one was traveling through, and I should say before I start too, there are two words here that are in Persian, which I hope I'm not murdering. Murshid, which means teacher, and mashuk, which means sweetheart. A perfect one was traveling through the desert. He was stretched out around the fire one night and said to one of his close ones, "There is a slave loose not far from us. He escaped today from a cruel master. His hands are still bound behind his back, and his feet are also shackled. I can see him right now praying for God's help. Go to him. Ride to that distant hill. About 100 feet up and to the right, you will find him in a small cave. He is there. Do not say a single word to him. Bring the man to me. God requests that I personally untie his body and press my lips to his wounds." The disciple mounts his horse and within 2 hours arrives at the small mountain cave. The slave sees him coming. The slave looks frightened. The disciple, on orders not to speak, gestures toward the sky, pantomiming, "God saw you in prayer. Please come with me. A great Murshid has used his heart's divine eye to know your whereabouts." The slave cannot believe this story and begins to shout at the man and tries to run, but trips from his bindings. The disciple now becomes forced to subdue him. Think of this picture now as they travel. The millions of candles in the sky are lit and singing. Every particle of existence is a dancing altar that some mysterious force worships. The earth is a church floor whereupon, in the middle of a glorious night, walks a slave, weeping, tied to a rope behind a horse with a speechless rider, taking him toward the unknown. Several times, with all of his might, the slave tries to break free, feeling he's being returned to captivity. And the rider stops, dismounts, brings his eyes near the prisoner's eyes. A deep kindness there communicates an unbelievable hope. The rider motions, soon you'll be free. Tears roll down from the rider's cheeks in happiness for this man. Anger, all this fighting and tormenting want, mashuk. God has seen you and sent a close one. Mashuk, God has seen your heart in prayer and sent Hafiz. May we be the ones who are sent, and may we be aware that we are. Namaste. Oh, thank you, Paula.